February 16, 1944, McMillan Pass, Northwest Territories Yukon border. The welder's torch hissed against steel at 11,000 feet elevation, high in the Mackenzie Mountains, where the temperature held at 42 degrees below zero. Chief welder Thomas Mackenzie from the Bechtel Price-Callahan crew positioned the final 4-inch pipe section, his breath crystallizing instantly in the thin mountain air. Behind him stretched 580 miles of pipeline snaking west toward Whitehorse. Ahead, another 20 miles descended toward Norman Wells and the oil that was supposed to save Alaska from Japanese invasion. This wasn't the welding job Mackenzie had imagined when he'd signed up 19 months earlier. The recruitment poster had been brutally honest. Men hired for this job will be required to work and live under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Temperature will range from 90 degrees above zero to 70 degrees below zero. But honesty about conditions couldn't prepare anyone for the reality. Machinery that refused to start, steel that fractured like glass, permafrost that swallowed equipment, and a construction timeline that defied every engineering principle Mackenzie had learned in 20 years of pipeline work. He struck the arc. Molten metal flowed into the joint, completing the connection between east and west construction crews who had been fighting toward each other through uncharted wilderness for nearly 2 years. The CANOL Project, Canadian oil, was now physically complete. 600 miles of 4-inch pipe laid directly on wooden timbers across permafrost, through mountain passes, over rivers that froze solid for 8 months each year. The pipeline that experts had declared impossible to build. The solution to a strategic crisis that, by the time Mackenzie made this final weld, had already largely resolved itself. But standing in that mountain pass, watching steam rise from the completed joint, Mackenzie couldn't have known the most extraordinary fact about the project he'd just helped finish. It had consumed more petroleum products during construction than it would ever deliver during operation. It was the biggest white elephant of the war, a pipeline that burned more fuel than it carried. If you want to know how the military justified this billion-dollar mistake, please hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. But at the start, no one cared about the cost. The mathematics of desperation had produced an engineering monument to military overreach, but 20 months earlier, logic hadn't mattered, only fear. June 3, 1942, 0534 hours. 2 Japanese aircraft carriers, Ryujo and Junyo, launched strikes against Dutch Harbor in Alaska's Aleutian Islands. 23 Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers and 12 Aichi D-3A dive bombers attacked the Naval Operating Base and Fort Meare's Army post. They struck oil tanks, beached a submarine, and set barracks ablaze. The raid killed 43 American servicemen and wounded 50 more. A follow-up strike the next day, June 4th, caused additional damage and casualties. 3 days later, on June 6th, Japanese naval forces under Rear Admiral Boshiro Hosogaya landed unopposed on Kiska Island. The Imperial Japanese Navy Occupation Force consisted of approximately 5,400 troops who quickly began constructing defensive positions and an airfield. The following day, June 7th, the 3rd 101st Independent Infantry Battalion under Major Matsutoshi Hozumi landed on Attu Island, 180 miles further west, capturing the island's 42 Aleut inhabitants and 2 American weather observers. For the first time since British forces burned Washington in August 1814, foreign troops occupied American territory. The psychological impact exceeded the strategic threat. Newspaper headlines screamed about invasion. Radio broadcasts speculated about Japanese bombers striking Seattle or San Francisco from Aleutian bases. The fact that Attu and Kiska were barren, fog-shrouded volcanic islands with minimal strategic value didn't matter. They were American soil, and Japan held them. Alaska, with fewer than 140,000 total inhabitants and minimal military infrastructure, suddenly became America's exposed northern flank. The newly constructed Alaska Highway, 1,500 miles of rough pioneer road connecting Dawson Creek, British Columbia, to Fairbanks, represented the only overland supply route to reinforce the territory. But that highway consumed fuel. Aircraft defending Alaska consumed fuel. The anticipated buildup of forces to retake the Aleutians would consume enormous quantities of fuel. And every gallon had to be shipped by tanker up the Inside Passage, through waters where Japanese submarines now prowled, and where fog, storms, and treacherous channels had claimed ships for a century. The fuel vulnerability was real. In 1942, Alaska had no domestic petroleum production. Everything, aviation gasoline, diesel fuel, heating oil, arrived by sea from refineries in California and Washington. A successful Japanese submarine campaign could strangle Alaska's defense without firing another shot at Dutch Harbor. On April 29, 1942, 5 weeks before the Aleutian invasion that would make his proposal seem prescient, James H. Graham, a civilian consultant to Lieutenant General Brehon Somervell's Army Service Forces, had presented a one-page memorandum suggesting an alternative: develop the oil field at Norman Wells in Canada's Northwest Territories, build a pipeline to Whitehorse, Yukon, and refine the crude oil there for distribution along the Alaska Highway and into Alaska itself. Graham's proposal rested on minimal research. He had studied maps and trade publications for 2 months in early spring 1942. He organized a one-day conference attended mostly by Army officials, none of whom had ever visited the region in question. The pipeline would traverse country so remote that Europeans had never mapped it, territory known only to the mountain den who hunted the Mackenzie Mountains and traded at posts along the Mackenzie River. Imperial Oil, which owned the Norman Wells field, had been producing there since a 1920 discovery. Current output, approximately 900 barrels per day, refined at a small on-site facility and distributed by barge to communities along the Mackenzie River during the brief summer navigation season. Graham proposed increasing production to 3,000 barrels per day and shipping it 600 miles southwest through unmapped mountains to a refinery that didn't exist, using a pipeline through country that had defeated every previous attempt at road construction. The next day, May 30, 1942, General Somervell signed a 2-paragraph directive ordering immediate construction. Target completion date, October 1, 1942, exactly 4 months away. The directive allocated no specific budget, required no competitive bidding, demanded no detailed engineering study. Build it now. Costs don't matter. Major General T.M. Robbins, an Army engineer, read Somervell's order and did elementary arithmetic. A few commercial barges operating on established waterways, the Inside Passage route that tankers already used, could transport 10 times the petroleum for 1/10 the cost and effort. No pipeline needed, no refinery construction, no drilling expansion in the Arctic, just contract existing tanker capacity. Harold Ikes, Secretary of the Interior and head of the Petroleum Administration for War, heard about the project through Washington gossip. He sent Somervell a memo calling it well-nigh fantastic. One tanker making 4 round trips per year, Ickes calculated, could supply as much aviation gasoline as the entire proposed drilling, piping, refining operation would produce, even if everything worked perfectly, which Ickes very much doubted it would. Somervell read the objections. He was unimpressed. The decision was made. Orders had been issued. The machinery was already moving. By June 4, 1942, 2,500 soldiers from Task Force 42, primarily the 388th Engineer Battalion, an all-African-American unit, had loaded equipment onto boats and barges at waterways in northern Alberta, 480 miles north of Edmonton. They began the river journey to Norman Wells, 1,600 miles northeast through the Athabasca River, across Lake Athabasca, down the Slave River to Great Slave Lake, then north down the Mackenzie River. The route passed through wilderness broken only by scattered Hudson's Bay Company trading posts and indigenous settlements. The navigable season lasted from early July to early October, perhaps 90 days. Ice closed the northern rivers by mid-October and didn't break up until late June. Everything needed for the winter's work had to arrive during that narrow window. The Aleutian invasion 8 days later transformed Somervell's questionable decision into apparent strategic necessity. What had been a logistics experiment became a military imperative. Japan held American soil. Alaska needed fuel security. CANOL would provide it. Imperial Oil had been producing oil at Norman Wells since August 24, 1920, the northernmost oil field in the world when discovered by geologist Theodore Link. The field sat at 65 degrees north latitude, accessible only by water during summer or by aircraft year-round. A small refinery constructed in the 1930s processed crude for local use. Everything functioned on a scale appropriate to supplying scattered communities along the Mackenzie River, a few hundred barrels daily, moved by barge during the navigation season, stored in tank farms for winter distribution. The CANOL Project demanded a transformation. Production would need to triple from 900 to 3,000 barrels per day. That meant new wells, new drilling rigs, expanded storage capacity, increased refining capability, all requiring equipment and personnel transported 1,600 miles into the Arctic. The pipeline route would climb from Norman Wells at 200 feet elevation, cross the Mackenzie Mountains reaching heights above 4,000 feet at McMillan Pass, then descend to Whitehorse at 2,300 feet. 600 miles as the crow flies, probably closer to 800 miles following terrain that could actually be traversed. Nobody knew for certain because nobody had ever surveyed a route. European knowledge of the region between Norman Wells and Whitehorse was fragmentary at best. The mountain Dene, Shuta-Gotani people lived in these mountains, following seasonal hunting routes that had been used for generations. They traded at posts along the Mackenzie River, coming down from the high country in summer and fall. But their trails followed game migration paths and water sources, not the straightest line between 2 points on an engineer's map. In October 1942, land surveyor Guy Blanchett, hired by Bechtel Price Callahan, met with Dene elders at Fort Norman, now Tulita, asking about possible routes through the Mackenzie Mountains. They described a trail system they had used for generations, crossing the range through what would later be named McMillan Pass. On October 15, 1942, Blanchett, 4 Dene guides, Fred Andrew, Little Edward Blondin, George Blondin, and Paul Wright, plus 2 others set out by dog sled to survey this route. They traveled in temperatures that dropped below -40 degrees Fahrenheit, crossing frozen rivers and climbing through mountain terrain where wind chill could reach lethal levels in minutes. The reconnaissance took weeks. Blanchett's notes described extreme difficulties with terrain, elevation changes that would challenge any pipeline route, and river crossings that would require substantial engineering. In December 1942 and January 1943, follow-up survey teams using heavy equipment attempted to trace the route Blanchet had identified. Caterpillar tractors, designed for earth-moving in moderate climates, encountered conditions they couldn't handle. At temperatures below -50 degrees Fahrenheit, diesel fuel turned to jelly in fuel tanks despite additives. Hydraulic fluid froze. Steel tracks became brittle and fractured. Operators discovered that rubber and plastic components simply shattered in the cold. The machines quit. The survey teams abandoned mechanical methods and returned to dog sleds and human observation. Route decisions, it became clear, would have to be made during construction, not before it. Meanwhile, at Norman Wells, the real work had begun. The 388th Engineer Battalion, an all-African-American unit of 1,238 enlisted men under 26 officers, all white except the chaplain, faced an assignment that would have seemed impossible even with ideal weather. Transport 30,000 tons of materials to a location accessible only by water during summer months, then construct infrastructure for expanded oil production in country where winter temperatures routinely hit 60 below zero. The assignment required first building a winter road from Peace River, Alberta to Norman Wells, approximately 1,100 miles across frozen rivers, through forests, over terrain that turned to impassable muskeg when temperatures rose above freezing. The 388th began in November 1942, as soon as the ground froze hard enough to support heavy equipment. They carved that winter road through some of the severest weather in 2 decades. In one section, crossing the Arctic Circle, thermometers registered 80 degrees below zero, a temperature at which exposed skin freezes in under a minute, breath crystallizes instantly, and steel becomes dangerously brittle. Work shifts could last no longer than 20 minutes before hypothermia forced rotation back to heated tents. Equipment operators learned counterintuitive lessons. Keep machines running continuously, never shut them down, because once stopped in that cold, they became impossible to restart. Diesel engines ran 24 hours a day for weeks. When fuel supplies ran low, crews siphoned from one machine to keep others operational. By April 1943, the 388th had successfully transported 8,000 tons of equipment to Norman Wells via that winter road. It represented one of the more remarkable logistical achievements of the entire war, and barely anyone outside military channels knew it had happened. At Whitehorse, the western terminus 600 miles from Norman Wells, different crews faced different challenges. A used refinery purchased from Corpus Christi, Texas, where it had processed warm Gulf Coast crude in humid subtropical climate, had to be disassembled piece by piece, loaded onto ships, transported up the Inside Passage to Skagway, Alaska, then moved by the White Pass and Yukon Railway to Whitehorse. There, in subarctic conditions where winter temperatures regularly dropped to 40 below zero, it would be reassembled and modified to process Norman Wells crude, which had very different properties from Texas oil. The Standard Oil Company of California provided consultants who tried to identify necessary modifications. Imperial Oil, which owned the Norman Wells field, agreed to expand production but expressed very great difficulties with the project's feasibility. They questioned whether Norman Wells could sustain 3,000 barrels per day. They questioned whether a 4-inch pipeline could transport that volume over 600 miles of mountain terrain. They questioned whether the refinery could process the crude reliably in Whitehorse's climate. Their questions were ignored. By spring 1943, the project's scale had become staggering. 10,000 workers labored simultaneously across 3 time zones. Construction camps sprouted in wilderness that had seen perhaps a few dozen Europeans in all of recorded history. Airstrips appeared along the Mackenzie River, 12 in total, carved from forests and graded from riverbanks, providing supply routes for locations inaccessible by water or winter road. Telegraph lines connected all key points, strung on poles cut from local timber and erected in permafrost that made post-hole digging an exercise in attacking frozen concrete with hand tools. The wire itself, exposed to temperature swings of over 140 degrees between summer and winter, expanded and contracted enough to snap connections regularly. The Bechtel-Price-Callahan Consortium hired 52,900 workers over the project's lifespan. Some lasted their full 9-month contracts. More than half quit before completing them, defeated by isolation, conditions, or simple realization that premium wages weren't worth the cost to body and spirit. BPC's recruitment posters had been brutally honest. Men hired for this job will be required to work and live under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Temperature will range from 90 degrees above zero to 70 degrees below zero. Men will have to fight swamps, rivers, ice, and cold. Mosquitoes, flies, and gnats will not only be annoying but will cause bodily harm. If you are not prepared to work under these and similar conditions, do not apply. They undersold it. Summer mosquitoes swarmed in clouds so thick they could suffocate a person who breathed deeply through their mouth. Black flies drew blood from any exposed skin. Workers wore head nets and gloves in 90-degree heat, choosing heat stroke risk over insect torture. One worker's diary described the insects as the worst feature of this entire God-forsaken operation. Winter brought different torments. The cold exceeded anything most workers had experienced. Touching bare metal with ungloved hands meant instant frostbite and skin left on the metal. Working in temperatures below -50 required specialized clothing that wasn't always available, especially early in the project. The Army had prioritized fighting troops for cold weather gear. Construction workers made do with whatever they could obtain or improvise. Equipment failure rates exceeded peacetime norms by factors of 5 or 10. Spare parts took weeks or months to arrive. Maintenance became creative improvisation, welding broken components, fabricating replacement parts from scrap metal, adapting equipment designed for temperate construction to Arctic conditions. By December 1943, construction crews working from both Norman Wells and Whitehorse were within miles of each other, converging on McMillan Pass. Behind them lay 2 years of the most demanding construction work any of them would experience. Ahead lay the final connection and the test of whether any of it would actually work. December 19, 1943. Norman Wells. Oil entered the pipeline for the first time. The Norman Wells crude had unique properties. Its pour point, the temperature below which it ceased to flow, sat well below freezing. This meant the 4-inch pipeline could operate in 80 below zero temperatures without heating. But it also meant something else, something the rushed planning had failed to adequately address: permafrost. Across much of the route, the ground remained frozen year-round to depths of hundreds of feet. But permafrost isn't uniform rock-hard ice. It's a complex matrix of frozen soil, rock, and ice lenses that responds unpredictably to thermal changes. The surface layer, called the active layer, thaws each summer to depths of 1 to 3 feet, then refreezes in winter. Standard pipeline engineering called for burying pipes to protect them from surface damage and temperature extremes. But burying a pipe in permafrost creates a thermal bridge. Even crude oil at ambient temperature transfers heat into surrounding ground. That heat thaws the permafrost. Ice lenses melt, the ground settles, the pipeline sinks, creating low spots where oil pools, which creates more heat, which causes more settling. The CANOL engineers chose the opposite approach: surface laying. The 4-inch steel pipe was placed directly on wooden timbers laid across the ground surface. No burial, no insulation between pipe and wood. The wooden supports themselves rested directly on permafrost or on thin gravel beds. This method simplified construction in frozen ground. It allowed rapid deployment by crews working in impossible weather. It meant the pipeline could be laid year-round, a critical advantage given the compressed timeline. It also created cascading problems that became apparent as soon as oil began flowing. The wood timbers conducted heat from the pipe into the permafrost. In summer, the active layer thawed normally, then thawed deeper beneath the pipeline. In winter, refreezing occurred unevenly, creating frost heave that lifted sections of pipe. The cycle repeated each year: thaw and settle in summer, freeze and heave in winter. The pipeline began to undulate like a sine wave. At points where the pipe crossed streams or depressions, wooden trestle bridges supported the line. These structures experienced differential settlement as their foundations shifted. At river crossings, spring breakup brought ice flows that could shear through exposed pipe sections. Ruptures occurred with shocking frequency. Of the 1,161,394 barrels of oil pumped into the pipeline at Norman Wells during its operational life, only 971,685 barrels, 83.7%, reached Whitehorse. The missing 189,709 barrels, roughly 8 million gallons, leaked from pipeline breaks caused by permafrost instability, structural failure of wooden supports, and thermal stress fractures in steel that became brittle at extreme temperatures. But the engineers couldn't simply stop and redesign. The military imperative, real or imagined, demanded the pipeline operate. Oil that entered the line on December 19, 1943, didn't reach Whitehorse until April 1, 1944, 3 months to travel 600 miles through a pipeline plagued by ruptures, blockages from ice formation despite the low pour point, and pump station failures in brutal cold. The grand opening ceremony was held on April 30, 1944. By then, American and Canadian forces had recaptured Attu Island in May 1943 after a brutal 19-day battle that killed 549 Americans and virtually annihilated the 2,900-man Japanese garrison. In August 1943, an invasion force of 34,000 Allied troops landed on Kiska and discovered the Japanese had evacuated the island 2 weeks earlier under cover of fog. The strategic rationale for CANOL no longer existed. The pipeline operated anyway. To understand how CANOL happened requires understanding General Brehon Somervell. Somervell had built his reputation on seemingly impossible construction projects delivered under impossible timelines. As head of the Works Progress Administration in New York City from 1936 to 1940, he oversaw construction of LaGuardia Airport and hundreds of Depression-era public works. In 1941, commanding the construction division of the Quartermaster Corps, he supervised construction of the Pentagon, pushing through a design in 1 weekend, adding a 5th story against objections, completing the building in 16 months at a cost that ballooned from $35 million to $63 million. His philosophy was simple. When war demands speed, costs don't matter. When strategic necessity requires the impossible, engineering constraints become suggestions to overcome, not limits to accept. Promoted to Lieutenant General on March 9, 1942, Somervell became Commanding General of the Services of Supply, later renamed Army Service Forces. He reported directly to Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall and Undersecretary of War Robert P. Patterson. His authority over military logistics was nearly absolute. Senator Harry S. Truman, chairman of the Senate Special Committee to investigate the National Defense Program, captured Somervell's approach in testimony. "I will say this for General Somervell, he will get the stuff, but it's going to be hell on the taxpayer. He has a WPA attitude on the expenditure of money." The CANOL Project embodied that attitude perfectly. Somervell's May 30, 1942 directive setting an October 1 completion date represented fantasy. He later admitted to the Truman Committee that he privately thought summer 1943 might be possible. Even that estimate proved wildly optimistic, but the compressed timeline justified emergency measures. No competitive bidding for contracts, no detailed environmental surveys, no comprehensive engineering studies, priority access to scarce materials needed for other war production, unlimited budget authority. The Bechtel-Price-Callahan Consortium operated on a cost-plus contract, all expenses reimbursed plus guaranteed profit margins. This removed any incentive to control costs or question whether particular expenditures made sense. When equipment failed in extreme cold, new equipment was ordered. When the route proved impossible, expensive detours were constructed. When workers quit, premium wages attracted replacements. The logic was wartime logic. Alaska must be defended. Alaska requires fuel. Tanker routes are vulnerable. Therefore, build the pipeline. Costs are irrelevant measured against the cost of losing Alaska to Japan. But wartime logic can justify remarkable waste when the threat that created urgency disappears before the response is complete. From Norman wells, expanding production required new drilling rigs, new workers, new infrastructure, all transported 1,600 miles of waterways with a 3-month navigable season. Equipment moved by barge suffered damage from ice and rapids. Replacement parts took months to arrive. The pipeline itself consumed 9,000 tons of 4-inch steel pipe, steel that could have built destroyer hulls or tank armor. The wooden timbers supporting it required harvesting from remote forests and transport to construction sites. The 10 pump stations needed diesel generators, fuel storage tanks, maintenance equipment, and rotating crews of operators. The Whitehorse refinery, designed for warm Texas crude, had to be modified for Norman Wells' low-gravity oil. These modifications weren't completed until November 1944, 7 months after oil first arrived, delaying aviation gasoline production until the war was nearly over. Every element compounded, every solution created new problems requiring additional resources, and through it all, General Somervell refused to acknowledge the project might be a mistake. When the War Department questioned costs, Somervell submitted reassuring but vague reports. When the Truman Committee began investigating in late 1943, Somervell insisted, "The project will be completed in December or January. It is utterly foolhardy to talk of discontinuing the project at this stage of the game." He was wrong on both counts. April 1944 through March 1945, the pipeline operated. At Norman Wells, crews pumped crude oil into the 4-inch line at an average rate of 175 cubic meters per day, roughly 1,100 barrels. This represented 1/3 of the target capacity of 3,000 barrels daily. The pumps ran continuously, fighting friction, elevation changes, and the tendency of even low pour point crude to thicken in extreme cold. Every day, somewhere along the 600-mile route, something failed. Pump Station 4, located at mile 147 near the Mackenzie Mountain summit, experienced generator failure in January 1945 when temperatures dropped to 72 below zero. Oil flow stopped. The crude in the pipeline began to cool. Despite its low pour point, stationary oil at that temperature started to solidify. When the generator was repaired 3 days later and pumping resumed, a pressure surge from restart ruptured a pipe section weakened by thermal cycling. Cleanup crews discovered the rupture because oil had pooled on the snow surface, creating a black stain visible from passing aircraft. The break had been leaking for at least 12 hours. Estimated loss, 3,000 barrels. The section required cutting out damaged pipe, welding new sections, and pressure testing, a process that took 2 weeks in February conditions. That rupture was neither the first nor the last. At the Pelly River crossing, spring breakup in May 1944 brought ice flows that struck the exposed pipeline section suspended on wooden trestles. The impact sheared clean through the 4-inch steel. Oil sprayed into the river. Emergency crews arrived to find the break, but containing spilled oil in a raging spring runoff proved impossible. The pipeline was shut down for repairs that consumed 6 days and required helicopter transport of materials to the remote crossing. At McMillan Pass, where the final weld had been completed in February 1944, permafrost dynamics caused the wooden support timbers to settle unevenly through the summer active layer thaw. By August, a 100-foot section of pipeline had developed a pronounced sag. Oil pooled in the low point. The pooling increased pressure on the already stressed pipe, which was also experiencing thermal contraction cycles between day and night temperatures varying by 60 degrees. The pipe didn't rupture, it simply cracked, a hairline fracture that wept crude oil continuously at perhaps 5 barrels per day. The leak was small enough that operators initially missed it in daily pressure readings. Only when vegetation around the crack died and the ground became saturated with oil did inspection crews locate the problem. These weren't dramatic disasters, they were chronic, grinding mechanical failures that characterized the pipeline's entire operational life. At Whitehorse, the refinery struggled with its own challenges. The used equipment shipped from Texas required constant maintenance. The modifications needed to process Norman Wells crude were implemented piecemeal. For the first 7 months, the refinery could only produce motor gasoline, not the aviation gasoline that had been the project's primary strategic justification. When aviation gasoline production finally came online in November 1944, it could be produced only intermittently due to equipment limitations. The accounting was brutal. Each barrel of crude oil delivered to Whitehorse had consumed more energy in transport and processing than the barrel contained. The refinery itself used approximately 25% of incoming crude just to operate its furnaces and generators. Distribution of refined products required additional pump stations, consuming more fuel. The net energy return was negative. Meanwhile, 12 commercial tankers per year delivered petroleum products to Alaska via the Inside Passage despite the Japanese threat everyone had feared. Not one was sunk by enemy action. Each tanker carried more fuel in a single voyage than the CANOL project would produce in its entire operational life. Construction statistics. Total project cost $133 to $134 million, equivalent to approximately $2.4 billion in 2024. Personnel, 52,900 workers hired over project lifespan. Worker turnover, more than 50% failed to complete 9-month contracts. Construction timeline, May 1942 to April 1944, 23 months. Pipeline completion, February 16, 1944, final weld at McMillan Pass. Infrastructure built. Main pipeline, Norman Wells to Whitehorse, 600 miles. Pipeline diameter, 4 inches. Winter and summer roads, 3,000 miles. Pump stations, main line, 10. Pump stations for distribution, 19. Airstrips constructed, 12. Operational performance. First oil into pipeline, December 19, 1943. First oil reaching Whitehorse, April 1, 1944. Operational period, approximately 13 months, April 1944 to April 1945. Total crude pumped at Norman Wells, 1,161,394 barrels. Total crude reaching Whitehorse, 971,685 barrels, or 83.7% efficiency. Oil lost to pipeline breaks, 189,709 barrels, approximately 8 million gallons. Comparative economics. Cost per barrel via CANOL, over $150, calculated from total cost and output. Tanker shipments to Alaska, 12 tankers annually, each carrying more petroleum than CANOL's total output. Tanker losses to enemy action, 0. Steel consumed, 9,000 tons of 4-inch pipe, enough to build 50 Liberty ships. On March 8, 1945, 11 months after the Whitehorse refinery's grand opening, the U.S. War Department ordered the CANOL project shut down. The decision surprised no one who had been paying attention. The Truman Committee's December 1943 report had called the project's waste inexcusable. The strategic justification had evaporated when Japan abandoned the Aleutians in August 1943. The operational economics made continuation absurd, but military bureaucracy, once committed, resists reversal. Work began immediately to winterize equipment, clean and stock camps, and remove personnel. The Canadian government, offered first right of purchase, had already concluded that operating costs exceeded any benefit. The U.S. Army hoped to sell the entire project to private industry. No buyers emerged. The system was sold for scrap. Imperial Oil purchased equipment at Norman Wells for $3 million, 1% of construction costs. The Whitehorse refinery, installed at a cost of $27 million, sold for $1 million to Imperial Oil, who dismantled it and shipped it to Alberta for the Leduc oil strike. The pipeline itself, that 4-inch steel line that had consumed 23 months of brutal labor and $134 million in scarce wartime resources, was abandoned in place. Some sections were later salvaged and sold. Most remained where they lay, rusting slowly in the permafrost that had defeated them from the beginning. The CANOL project stands as perhaps the purest example of how emergency thinking can override engineering reality, how bureaucratic momentum can perpetuate obvious failure, and how wartime necessity, real or perceived, can justify any expense until the necessity vanishes. But it wasn't entirely waste. The Alaska Highway, built concurrently with CANOL and sharing some infrastructure, remained operational and eventually became a vital commercial route linking Alaska to the continental United States. The airstrips along the Mackenzie River, built to support CANOL, provided infrastructure that benefited post-war northern development. The winter roads pioneered techniques later used in Arctic resource development. Most importantly, the engineering lessons learned building in permafrost proved invaluable. When the Trans-Alaska Pipeline was designed 30 years later, engineers studied CANOL's failures exhaustively. They learned to elevate pipelines on thermally isolated supports. They learned to incorporate flexibility for thermal expansion and ground movement. They learned that permafrost requires not just acknowledgement, but comprehensive understanding based on detailed geotechnical surveys. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline, carrying hot oil that would catastrophically destabilize permafrost if buried, runs 420 miles elevated on vertical support members designed specifically to prevent thermal transfer into frozen ground. Each of those 78,000 vertical supports exists because engineers examined what went wrong with CANOL and vowed not to repeat it. In 1990, the CANOL Trail, the maintenance road built alongside the abandoned pipeline, was designated a National Historic Site. Today, it's considered one of Canada's most challenging wilderness hiking routes, 220 miles of deteriorated roadbed, missing bridges, rusting equipment, and scattered petroleum waste slowly being remediated. Hikers who complete the trail report finding sections of the original 4-inch pipeline still lying on disintegrated wooden timbers, monuments to the engineering philosophy that believed wartime urgency justified any cost, any risk, any gamble against nature itself. That philosophy delivered the Pentagon in 16 months. It mobilized American industrial capacity to build the greatest military force in history. It helped win World War II. But in the frozen wilderness of the Canadian Northwest, where permafrost imposes limits that bureaucratic willpower cannot overcome, that philosophy built a pipeline that operated for 13 months before economic reality forced the military imperative to surrender. The final accounting: for every barrel of fuel CANOL delivered, tanker ships delivered 12,000. The project that was supposed to protect Alaska from Japanese attack consumed resources that could have built 50 Liberty ships. The pipeline proclaimed impossible became reality at a cost that proved the experts right after all. General Brehon Somervell never became a candidate for the presidency, as some had once predicted. He retired in 1946 and died in 1955, his reputation forever shadowed by the Truman Committee's withering assessment of his most infamous project. The CANOL pipeline, by contrast, achieved a kind of immortality, not as a triumph of American engineering, but as proof that some limits, physical, geographical, thermodynamic, cannot be overcome simply by declaring them strategic imperatives and throwing unlimited resources at the problem. In February 1944, when Chief Welder Thomas Mackenzie completed that final joint at McMillan Pass, he had accomplished something genuinely extraordinary: building a pipeline through country experts said couldn't be crossed, in weather that regularly killed exposed machinery, on a timeline that defied every principle of project management. That the pipeline he built never should have been built at all doesn't diminish the achievement, it clarifies it. Sometimes the most impressive engineering feats are the ones that prove we should have listened to the people who said impossible in the first place. The permafrost always wins in the end.